the work that we do and all of the different aspects of noise that were addressed in the film are areas of research over there, and we're working on methods to be able to measure sounds that animals are receiving, and really trying to get a deeper understanding of how these sounds impact not only their communication, but then also other aspects of their biology. So I'll
think that with the dramatic ramping down of commercial whaling, as was touched on in the movie, that maybe the protection of whales and dolphins is something that was solved by our parents' generation. That's far from true. There's a wide variety of threats, including noise, as so poignantly highlighted in the movie, that these animals face, both in waters here off the Cape and Islands and internationally.
This is a topic that's particularly close to my heart. I've been an environmental lawyer for 35 years and have been working on the problem of undersea noise pollution for over 20 now, and it's involved a series of lawsuits that was alluded to in the film, primarily against the U.S. Navy, which has a self-image of being a steward of our oceans, and yet there's an obvious disconnect between how and where it chooses to test and train with high-intensity military sonar. This is some of the loudest sound that humans know how to make. And we have made significant progress with the Navy. Just last year we had a major breakthrough in a lawsuit that we filed with respect to training off Southern California and Hawaii, where for the first time, in the wake of a very strong opinion by a judge in our favor in Hawaii, for the first time the Navy agreed to stay out of certain areas when it tests and trains. And this may seem logical to most of us, but to the Navy it is interfering with one of their most closely guarded prerogatives, which is how they safeguard our national security, how they protect against submarines, which are a threat primarily to aircraft carriers and everybody on them. So we're making progress, but it's a long fight, and we're also working on addressing shipping noise, which you saw as one of the major causes of the rise in ambient noise levels throughout the oceans. And then finally, the noise generated from these incredibly loud air cannons by oil companies as they seek to find oil beneath the ocean surface. In fact, today, NRDC and some 30 other groups filed an administrative petition with the Bureau of Energy Management calling for a halt to the planned seismic testing along the Atlantic coast from Maryland all the way to Florida. A program, by the way, that has been approved by the Obama administration. So if they don't come to terms, if they don't respond as we believe that the scientific evidence demands, then we'll be back in court.
But it's true that what was said in the film is the Navy is a big source of funding for, but I wouldn't say that there's an excess of funding by any stretch of the imagination. It's generally that particular issue. It's an applied issue, so the more sort of basic science type funding agencies like the National Science Foundation will not touch issues like that. So it is challenging to fund work that is focused specifically on that.
One great irony is the U.S. Navy funds 70% of all the acoustic research in this country, 50% of all the acoustic research in the world. So it's, on the one hand, a major contributor. On the other hand, it clearly has a strong interest in understanding more about how the marine ecosystem works and is affected by sound. In response to your first question, it's a good one. A lot of people don't understand that a national marine sanctuary is only as good as the regulations that are adopted for that particular sanctuary. So depending on what the various interests are, the stakeholder interests are when a particular sanctuary is established, the protections may be very minimal. In the film, we had that very dramatic graphic of Stellwagen Bank, where that it looks kind of like a trapezoid, and you had all those little firefly lights of the calls of the northern right whales, which, by the way, is one of the most endangered species of whales on the planet today. And then you'd have these ships coming right through the sanctuary, obliterating their ability to hear each other. So that's, I think, a graphic illustration of the fact that marine sanctuaries generally do not address sound. Now, there are other federal laws that we have used successfully to address sound. The Marine Mammal Protection Act is a uniquely protective federal environmental law. The National Environmental Policy Act is sort of the constitution of environmental law in this country. It requires an environmental impact statement. And when we began, when we first learned about Navy sonar, we discovered that they weren't complying with any of these statutes. I mean, nothing. No permits, no mitigation of any kind, no environmental reviews. I mean, you name it, they were not doing it. And so we systematically began through using the federal courts to make progress. We won virtually all of those cases, and you know, it's we've made progress, but we're not where we need to be.
I just say that Joel personally in NRDC, sometimes over the past couple decades, with groups like the International Fund for Animal Welfare, often alone in pioneering this issue, have really created a sea change, if you'll pardon the expression, I'm full upon, in awareness of the issue. And awareness, of course, has to precede action. Our organization has invested significant funding and attention in different countries around the world trying to campaign vis-a-vis the shipping industry, vis-a-vis the oil and gas industry, or what have you, on the ocean noise issue. And it's been very difficult to get traction. In fact, that was the genesis of our interest in collaborating with NRDC, a longtime and valued partner, on this film, because it's true in the Congress today. This is not yet an issue that receives the level of attention that it needs to receive. Other threats, historic, like commercial whaling or pollution of marine habitats, ship strikes with North Atlantic right whales are more familiar. But part of the reason that we painstakingly, as Joel says, over a 4-year period created this vehicle was to begin to explain some of the basic principles about why noise has such a profound impact on the marine environment, and these creatures who, like us, depend on a healthy marine environment for their own health and welfare. Don't despair. It can sometimes feel a little bit down. There are very positive signs. Joel mentions, even since we locked on this movie, an important agreement with the U.S. Navy to protect and restrict dramatically activities off of Southern California and Hawaii in terms of areas where they are doing their training. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration will, early next week, release a multi-year ocean noise strategy to begin to implement and take a look at what needs to be done in national marine sanctuaries and in U.S. and international waters to begin to address this issue more seriously. So we're discovering more. There's cause for despair in terms of some of the profound impacts that we're having that we haven't realized up to now. But as Michael Jasny so poignantly put it in the movie, the one good thing about ocean noise is when you stop making the noise, it goes away. It's one of the problems that are easier and less intractable in some ways than other challenges that we and these animals face. Quickly, if there is the political will.
One of my favorite lines in the movie is the one that Patrick just mentioned. See, Patrick and I have been doing these panels so many times now, we step on each other's toes all the time.
What a question.
Cooperation with the U.S. government made inroads with the International Maritime Organization, which regulates commercial shipping, for the first time to actually come up with guidelines for ship construction to reduce noise. And this has led to conversations with the leadership of a number of the major shipping companies, including Maersk. We're not far enough along yet to know whether that's going to be a productive dialogue. It is a win-win-win when you reduce sound in the ocean from ships, because it saves the companies significant amounts of money. It enhances the Navy's ability to defend against submarines, and it protects the environment. So I think that's an area where, in contrast to our experience with the Navy when we needed the intervention of federal courts, there's reason to be optimistic that we can actually come to terms collaboratively on progress.
Maersk and Costco, which through a series of mergers will soon be the world's largest shipping company, got a lot of free advertising in Sonic Sea. That reality has not escaped them. And both in direct interactions with those companies, with work together, sometimes adversarial, often collaborative at the International Maritime Organization, as Joel outlines, where we've had progress with this voluntary code of conduct and some recommendations for ship design from the Marine Environment Protection Committee of the IMO. We're also, together with NRDC, working with the World Shipping Council, which has its headquarters in Washington, D.C., to address some of these issues on a trade association and company-by-company basis. And they're watching as the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration releases its ocean noise strategy, as we prepare, working with Congressman Bill Keating and a bipartisan group of members of the House and Senate on some early legislation focused particularly on national marine sanctuaries and ocean noise. They're tuning into this issue more and more. One last thing that I learned from our scientists, and that is big ships, which look so imposing and intimidating on the screen, sometimes are a net benefit. More modern and fewer in number, the larger ships can have a positive impact on reducing the noise, because some of the smaller, noisiest ships in the fleet being pulled out of the merchant marine fleet. So size does matter in some sense, but it's not necessarily a bad thing that these more modern ships are so large in terms of the noise contribution. Good groups, including Conservation Law Foundation, obviously have been very involved with this. Thankfully, what our learning has been is that it's principally in the preparation of the site and in the pile driving phase for construction is when the most significant impacts in terms of noise in the marine environment, marine mammals, are felt. And there are some practical solutions, whether in terms of bubble curtains being used, putting simple rubber caps on some of the equipment, etc., can dramatically buffer the noise signature. But I suspect I don't need to lecture this group about wind. It's a pretty
Federal permitting laws do provide a means to impose those kinds of mitigation measures.
Yeah, and I have to say, I was sitting here racking my brain, and then I realized, wait a minute, I know more about what's going on in Hauraki Gulf, New Zealand, off the southern coast of Sri Lanka, and in the Straits of Gibraltar on this stuff than I do in my own backyard, and it's an embarrassment, except my focus tends to be international.
We represent advocacy groups. We're not in the filmmaking business, so it's not all that satisfying just to make a film. It doesn't accomplish anything. So that once you make a good film, you have to figure out a distribution plan. And we have the number one thing that is good news on distribution is the Discovery Channel bought this film, and it premiered on globally last Thursday night. Have this film available, which is Washington, D.C., members of Congress, and members of the administration, and we're going to be doing cut-downs of this film because an hour film is going to be too much for a lot of those kinds of settings.
I should also note, it's been fascinating to premiere this movie in whaling countries. There are only 3 left, Iceland and Norway. Last Friday evening, a week ago tomorrow night, I was in Oslo with a Norwegian scientist and a colleague from IFAW showing this to a fascinated Norwegian audience who almost applauded when Mr. Nicolaisen came on the screen. And their principal focus and a lot of the Q&A afterward had to do with oil and gas exploration in the North Sea. And the Norwegian government has just opened up a new block of areas. They're very concerned with the impact on fish stocks, obviously, so.
I just want to say, if you've ever been hit by a sonar ping, it's amazing the sound. In 1970, I was in the Coast Guard and we pulled up into base Boston. Now, being a coastie, we didn't know much about sonar, but we were up there sound asleep, and all of a sudden we were all waking up because the Navy across the way was doing sonar tests. So the 2 weeks that we were in Boston, we basically had to sleep up on top of the deck. Now, that was 1970. I can only imagine the power of sonar today.
Well, that's a really helpful point, and let me just expand on it a little bit in terms of the intensity level. We talk about it being as loud as humans can make sound, but if you consider this fact, the 120 decibels is what's called the noise aversion threshold for large whales, because it's the point at which over 50% of whales affected will hear the sound, change their migration, diverge, and go around the sound. So they're obviously hearing it, they're obviously annoyed by it, or enough to avoid it. The sound of one of these sonar devices is 235 decibels, which makes it 200 billion times more intense than the noise aversion threshold. It's more like a physical force and less like a sound. So if you were within a meter of one of these things, you would die. You simply would not be able to survive it. One of the tensions in making this film was, how loud can we make the soundtrack? And,
Yeah, right.
You know, I was
You don't drive people out.
one of those voices wanting us to crank it up louder and louder and louder, because you can make an audience extremely uncomfortable by still a very small fraction of what the actual real-world sound of one of these devices is. And I will say I lost the fight for much of it,